Hi everyone, this is Thomas King, and today I'd like to bring you a very important lecture that is the value of the pieces. Now, I referenced the value of the pieces yesterday because it really is necessary for all tactical play. However, I haven't made a video on it, and although technically I'm skipping ahead to lesson 3, I've also developed a basics course which is a recommended viewing order for those new to the game that they view just before they start really digging into lesson 2. So, in chess, not all pieces are created equal. It's often said that chess is a metaphorical representation of war, and that's absolutely right. The pawns represent peasants in a war situation. The knights represent the steeds, the highest ranks of common society. The bishops, of course, represent the religious officials. This is a medieval game, and it has medieval screw you, I'm not tolerating your religion attributes as well. The rooks, you might have guessed, symbolize a castle. The queen, it's a tough one, but the queen actually symbolizes the queen. And another tough one is the king, which you'd never guess it, but the king symbolizes the king. And like in the medieval ages, in the Middle Ages, peasants were not equal to kings or queens. And this is emphasized in the different movement of the pieces. A pawn is considered to be worth only 1 point. A knight and a bishop, they are both considered to be worth 3 points. We'll discuss over this a bit more of this a bit later. Rook is considered to be worth 5 points. The queen is considered to be worth 9 points. And a king is it's invaluable. It's just too powerful to be judged. However, because we can't lose the king. However, that's its importance as its power goes. We often say that it's slightly more powerful than the minor pieces, but less powerful than the rook. So you might ask yourself, why is such an evaluation necessary? Well, the reason is that if you can trap a king in the corner, then effectively you're playing 4 points up. So, why? Why is a pawn worth only 1 point, but a queen worth 9? Well, this lies within the mobility of the pieces. If we take the following position here, well, I'm just going to add a queen, a white king on h2, and a black king. If we look at this queen, it controls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27 squares on this chessboard. This queen is an absolute hog. It's literally covering half the chessboard, restricting its opponents to just mere strands. If this were Go, the green team would be absolutely thrashing here, because everything that would be red would just be entranced within the queen's power. The queen has the best mobility of all the pieces, and for that reason it is considered the most powerful. It's not the most valuable. The king remains the most valuable. Chess is a sexist game, that's why it's so popular. And as such, the king, the male piece, is more valuable than the queen. But the queen is still a pretty important piece, and it's the most powerful. It can control an entire board, really. Just restricting the opponent with limited movements to isolated strands of the board. Now, if we compare the movement of the queen, which was able to attack 27 squares and occupy 1, let's compare this to the rook. The rook, considered to be worth 5 points, ought to be the second best piece. Let's see how it fares in comparison to the queen. So, the rook attacks 7 squares on its rank and 7 squares on its file. The rook, although it's the second most powerful piece, only controls 14 squares in the center. That's interesting, isn't it? The queen, even though the rook is still easily the second most powerful piece, it still completely pales in comparison to the queen. Next we have the bishop. Now remember, bishops move on diagonals. And diagonals are not as important as ranks or files. Why? Well, because in chess you can't have a shortened rank or file. So in this current position, the bishop controls 13 squares across 2 diagonals. This is a very good bishop. It's almost as powerful as a rook on e4. It's controlling 13 squares. This bishop is doing its job. It's still not quite as powerful as the rook if it were placed here, but it's still doing a good job. However, diagonals, unlike files or ranks, can be shortened. A file or rank always is the same length. But this diagonal here, that I'm highlighting in green now, is worth only 3 squares, compared to the 7 that a diagonal is capable of. So if I just chuck the bishop on h1, and then compare it to a rook on a8, both in the corner. No. So the rook, again, it controls 14 squares, but the bishop now controls only 7. Because it moves along the diagonal, the bishop's movement is significantly restricted when it's not in the center of the board. The queen's movement is restricted too because it moves on diagonals as well. It's not as significant because it still has the power of the rook, which is powerful no matter where it's placed. But because of this, the placement of the bishop is very important. That said, if you thought the bishop was treated cruelly by a placement away from the center of the board, then obviously you haven't even heard of the knight. Because let's just take a look at this knight here on e4. It controls 8 squares, owing to its unusual L-shaped movement. Okay, this is owing to its unusual L-shaped movement. The knight controls 8 squares. It's a good knight. It's still not as powerful as a knight or as a bishop at its best, but it still controls 8 squares. But let's just see how it fares in the corner of the board, because the knight is severely restricted in the corner of the board. So instead of being placed on d5, now I'll put it on a1. And from here, we can see that the knight controls only 2 squares, c2 and b3. Just might leave you asking, how come the knight is considered as powerful as the bishop? And the reason is that the knight can control 8 squares from okay, this is very weird. Let's just delete it with the there we go. The reason for that lies in the knight's the ability to restrict the knight from its own pieces. Bishop on b2 and a knight on a1. Okay, kings that don't matter. This knight can still, thinking about it logically, this knight, it ought to be an inferior piece to this bishop, because the knight is in the corner of the board, whereas the bishop is on b1. But the bishop is very easily restricted by its own pawns, because pawns can get in the way. They can't just occupy the squares, as is the case with the knight. They can also just completely cut off this diagonal. This bishop has no access to any of these squares just because of this naughty little pawn on c2 in the way. So that's why, in spite of its inferior movement capabilities, the knight is considered as powerful as the bishop, at least in short. And finally, next we'll show the king, why it's considered to be slightly more powerful than a minor piece. So the king controls 8 squares, and it can control 8 very important squares at a given time. And if we place it in the corner, say for example on h1, we've still got 3 squares. It moves simply. It doesn't easily get restricted by its own pawns. The king is considered slightly more powerful than a bishop or a knight. And finally, we have the poor old pawn, which can only move to 1 square. Of course, it can control 2 squares, and it can be completely blocked off by an unfriendly neighbor just blocking its way. The pawn has barely any power unless it is threatening to queen, and as such it is considered to be worth only 1 point. So anyway, there is my lecture on the value of the pieces. I will continue to do the basics of chess before I continue fully with lesson 2. So anyway, thank you for watching this video, and see you next time.